Hello, my curious colleague. You have landed on Renegade Files, your underground connection to paranormal tales, unsolved mysteries, and alternative cultural analysis. You are now in the company of outcasts. I am your host, Lex Gordon, sending you this encrypted transmission from the Jungle Villa outpost deep in the uncharted tropics. This is Renegade Files episode 85, The Satanic Panic. In this episode, we'll put on our wizard cloaks, roll the 20-sided die, and explore the worlds of Dungeons & Dragons, and the way this creative game spawned a nationwide moral panic. Then we will dive into some of the popular culture movies and books which fueled the nation's fears with stories of the devil and all of his sinful works. Finally, we'll see how this culminated in one of the longest and most expensive trials in American history, the McMartin preschool trial, where hundreds of children accused dayschool workers of being satanic witches who could fly, who kidnapped zoo animals and flushed kids down toilets into underground chambers of satanic ritual abuse. So join me, my fellow lover of all things weird, as we dive into the hard-to-believe facts of the American Satanic Panic. And before we jump in, I'd like to say thank you to the You're Wrong About podcast and their episode, Dungeons & Dragons, The Satanic Panic, plus their work on some of the books we mentioned in this episode as well. I'll put a link to their website in the show notes so you can check out their show. Once again, it's a podcast called You're Wrong About, and it's good. Part 1. Dungeons & Dragons. Many modern Netflix fans and people of a certain age were first introduced to the game Dungeons & Dragons when watching the 80s throwback series Stranger Things. In Stranger Things, a group of young friends is thrust into a nightmarish parallel dimension when the activities of their fantasy Dungeons & Dragons campaign begin to leak through into their hometown of Hawkins. I really liked those shows, particularly the first season, and I'm waiting, like the rest of us, for them to ever wrap it up, and by the time they do, Mike, Eleven, Will, Lucas, and Dustin might be pushing walkers and playing bridge instead of riding BMX bikes and fighting monsters. But Dungeons & Dragons plays a big part in the Stranger Things series. It's a way to connect adolescent fantasy to the dangers of a fantastical fictional world. And throughout the show, the kids use skills that they've learned while playing the game to help them overcome obstacles, save each other from danger, and outwit both the bad guys and the authorities who, for the most part, have no clue about what they're actually trying to do. Dungeons & Dragons, called D&D for short, started in 1973 and grew out of the tactical wargaming creations of Gary Gygax and a few of his friends as they developed a tabletop fantasy game that combined the maps and terrain of war games with the fantasy and science fiction tropes of literature. The game has a sort of open-ended structure where players are led by the Dungeon Master. The Dungeon Master enforces the rules and provides the general outline of the story, as well as key plot points throughout the playing of the game, while individual players take on specific roles of the participants in the game. So, one player might be a wizard, another player might be a warrior, and others might be villains, elves, or crafty dwarves. Each player has a different skill set. So one might be really good at fighting, another might be really good at healing, and another might be excellent at tracking. The games are a sort of combination of role-playing, improvisational storytelling, and guided fantasy adventure, with the rolling of dice being the great equalizer. For example, when you are setting up your characters in the beginning of the game, or prior to a game, you fill out a character sheet that has listed all the many attributes, such as the previously mentioned fighting, healing, or tracking, and many others. And players do what's called rolling for ability, and maybe there's a few other terms for that. So if you're checking off the box for sword fighting, you roll the dice. The higher the number that you roll, the better you are at it when you play the game. And obviously, the lower number that you roll, the less effective you are at it. And in this way, players are given various levels of skill in a manner that's fair, or as fair as can be. At the same time, as you're playing the game, if you have to, let's just say, fight an ogre, then your first attempt might be to swing at it with a big club. So, you would roll the dice to see how good you did when you swung at it. If you get a higher number, wow, that's a good hit. If you get a low number, maybe that's a swing and a miss. So this is a very simple aspect of the game, but it makes it really cool, because what it does is it avoids all of those playground arguments you used to have when you were a kid. When you were playing cops and robbers and you would shoot at your friend, and of course you would say, "I hit you." And then your friend would say, "No, you missed me, I dodged it." And then you end up with these playground arguments. Rolling dice in Dungeons and Dragons takes all of that out of the game. A higher roll is a good hit, a lower number is a bad hit or a miss, and a pretty good variation exists, and the Dungeon Master is the one who interprets this in the final analysis. That's just a broad description of what the game is and how it's played. Players refer to the games as campaigns, and these can be short campaigns that are started and ended in one night, or longer campaigns that take weeks or months to finish, and some are virtually endless. There are stories about people playing a game of Dungeons and Dragons for their entire lives, right? So different skills can be built up over time, with people attaining higher and higher levels of abilities, and for people who really get into it, it can become extremely complex and incredibly immersive. So, for the most part, Dungeons & Dragons was a game that was made by young adults for young adults to play. It sort of got its start on college campuses, and from there, trickled down into high school age kids, and eventually maybe some younger junior high level drama club types. As I said before, these games can become extremely complicated. The rule books are long and dense and deep, and the campaigns are as complicated as any science fiction story. The types of kids who gravitated toward this were, and are, to generalize, highly creative, highly intelligent, willing and able to spend long periods of time alone studying something to get a good grasp on it, and often more comfortable in a fantasy situation than in a social situation. And like I said, this is just a generalization, but an accurate one, especially in the early days of the game in the 70s and the 80s. So as a parent in the 70s and 80s, and I guess up until today, there's a certain amount of pressure to raise a certain type of child. In broad terms, people want a child who does good in school, is responsible and socially polite, who doesn't do drugs and doesn't commit crimes, and who is able to make their way in society in a positive and successful way. What happened was, with the free love and drug culture of the 60s, we were handed a clear-cut, delineated roadmap for red flags to look out for if we were in the business of raising a normal kid. So in the 70s and 80s, what parents wanted to see were kids that didn't have their hair too long, that weren't stealing the parents' jewelry in order to buy weed, who had good friends, who did good in school, and who went off to college. So in a weird way, the Dungeons and Dragons phenomenon was a way for people to start to worry about all the other kids who didn't tick those original red flags. So for example, at a certain point as an American parent, if someone asked you, does your kid have a few close friends? And you were like, yeah, he's got some good friends. And then they asked, does your kid like to read? You were like, yeah, they like to read. Do they do drugs? No. Are they always going to big, wild teenage parties? No. And if that was your situation, then chances were you felt like you had a pretty good child. But Dungeons & Dragons kind of flipped that whole narrative, because now you've got these kids that only hang around 3 or 4 other kids, and that their circle of friends becomes extremely tight-knit. Not only do they like to read, it seems like all they do is read. And they're reading these really dense, weird Dungeons & Dragons rulebooks that no one from the outside can make any sense of if you try to look at it. Not only do these kids not drink or do drugs, they don't ever go to big, wild teenage parties. And all they do is sit in the basement with these 4 or 5 other friends of theirs, and sometimes they're extremely happy and jubilant, and other times they're terribly frightened or sad or depressed. And they sit in the dark and they mumble and roll dice, and the whole thing is just weird. Where at one point, the only parents who were worried were the parents of kids who had a bunch of crazy friends, who were always drinking and experimenting with drugs, who never liked to read, who were never at home, and those were the kids that you worried about. Dungeons & Dragons came along, and now the parents are worried about the kids who have a close-knit group of 5 or 6 friends, and all they do is read, they never leave the house, and they're dressing up like wizards and fairies in the basement, and the whole thing is just beyond the comprehension of most parents, especially at the time. In a way, it became the mechanism for parents to now worry about the smartest, most creative, and least threatening kids society has ever produced. So the game was a success right away, and the guys who started it formed a company called TSR, and that helped spread the game as sets of rulebooks, handbooks, and guides, as well as a magazine called The Dragon. This was over the 70s and early 80s. In 1981, TSR had revenues of nearly $13 million, with only 130 employees. So in August of 1979, at Michigan State University, a child prodigy named James Dallas Egbert III, who had entered the university at 16 years old, left a suicide note one day, took some Quaaludes, and ventured into the university's steam tunnels in hopes of passing out and thus dying. He was missing for an entire month, and some other students reported that they had last seen him at a Dungeons & Dragons convention in Wisconsin. However, James Egbert ended up surviving, and he then hid out at a friend's house. While the hunt for him was underway, the news media picked up on the Dungeons & Dragons convention tip and spun that into this idea that the boy had been a victim of the role-playing game gone wrong. Like some group playing it had killed him as a part of a satanic sacrifice in the game, or that he had believed he was actually a wizard and had tried to make his own potion which had killed him, or all manner of ideas like that. This was expounded upon when the main investigator, who was searching for Egbert, wrote a book called Dungeon Master in 1984 that played up the angle that Egbert had been a victim of some D&D cult, when in reality that was never the case. Then, later, following the successful suicide of Irving Pulling, a teenager who shot himself, his mother, Patricia Pulling, founded the group BADD, B-A-D-D, which stood for Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons, through which she sued TSR, who made Dungeons & Dragons, and her son's school principal for placing a curse on her son's D&D character in a game, and she believed the curse had caused the boy to kill himself. One irony being that Patricia Pulling observed and claimed over and over in her lectures and presentations to law enforcement departments that Dungeons and Dragons causes kids to become unable to distinguish between fantasy and reality. While at the same time, she fully believed that her son killed himself because his school principal had placed a curse on him in a D&D game. In the same year that BAD was formed, TSR pitched and sold their idea for the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon, which aired on Saturday mornings from 1983 to 1985. The fact that it was a kids' show made it a favorite target of organizations like BAD, claiming it was indoctrinating kids into witchcraft and Satanism. All of BAD's lawsuits fell through, and subsequently, in 1989, game player and designer Michael A. Stackpole wrote Game Hysteria and the Truth, which went into all the flaws, misconceptions, inaccuracies, omission of relevant details, and questionable practices surrounding Patricia Pulling's claim about role-playing games in general and D&D in particular. By 1981, the American Association of Suicidology, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, and Health and Welfare Canada all concluded that there was no causal link between fantasy gaming and suicide. In fact, tabletop gamers as a group have suicide rates far below the average population. Part 2. Media that fueled the Satanic Panic. As we have seen in multiple cases of sociological phenomena, such as the fad diagnosis of multiple personality disorder, media products have a powerful ability to influence collective opinion and public consciousness, especially when it comes to salacious, dramatic, or controversial subjects. For an in-depth analysis of this phenomenon, be sure to check out Renegade Files episode 76, Multiple Personality Disorder, The Extreme Controversies of Dissociation Psychopathology. Once again on this topic, we have multiple instances where ideas that are cultivated in creative productions, like books and movies, permeate their way into the minds of the population to become frameworks of understanding for activities in the real world. The first one we will take a look at here was a CBS TV movie of the week called Mazes and Monsters, based on the book of the same name by Rona Jaffe, and starring Tom Hanks in his first big role. This TV movie is about a game called Mazes and Monsters that gets out of hand and causes all kinds of drama and tragedy for the kids playing it. The game in the movie, Mazes and Monsters, was an obvious reference to Dungeons and Dragons, and it was responsible for putting this idea of a game doing real-world harm into the minds of the public. This television movie came out in 1982, 1 year after the book. In the movie, a group of dysfunctional misfits from dysfunctional homes meets at college and discovers that they have a shared affinity for the game Mazes and Monsters. One of the characters had been previously kicked out of high school for becoming too obsessed with the game and is reluctant to start playing it again. But his new friends convince him that everything will be fine, and they start playing Mazes and Monsters between classes and after other activities at college. One of the kids, JJ, is frustrated by his overbearing parents. He's troubled by the fact that his mother constantly redecorates his room without his permission, and his response to this is constantly wearing different crazy hats in order to express his individuality. Finally, I guess all the hats are too much for him, and he decides to commit suicide, which he plans to do in a series of abandoned caverns somewhere near the school grounds. when he goes into the caves to commit suicide, he changes his mind because he decides that the caves would be a great place for them to play a new campaign of their Mazes and Monsters game. He goes back and convinces his friends, and this is what they do. So not only is Mazes and Monsters an obvious copy of Dungeons and Dragons, but the intended and failed suicide of the character JJ in the caverns near the school is a fully formed idea that was obviously taken from the real-life situation of the young man who tried to kill himself at Michigan State University in the steam tunnels, who we just spoke about. So it's in the cave where things start to go sideways. One of the characters hallucinates, starts to believe that he is really the character he's playing in the game, that character being a cleric. And because this cleric in the game has taken a vow of celibacy, the player in real life breaks up with his real life girlfriend. He starts staying inside, drawing elaborate maps. He's trying to find some hidden hall, and the other characters get wrapped up in this and in their own delusions, and the whole thing just sort of goes crazy. So the group kind of splits up, and some of them travel to different parts of the country, and they chase each other around, and they use rules from the game to talk each other out of precarious situations and to snap each other out of their delusions, and all along the way, the stuff goes terribly wrong. People die, and the entire thing becomes unhinged. But despite all this chaos, in the final scene, we see the group gathered together, and collectively, they make the decision to play the game just one more time. Dun dun dun. I've never seen the movie, but it does seem like it would be an interesting watch. Maybe I'll try to find it. This movie had a pretty widespread impact. We've talked about TV movies before, and this is another one of those cases where a large amount of people saw the film. Once again, this was before Netflix and streaming services, and a lot of the country didn't even have cable yet, so a television movie on network TV at the time, when there were only 13 channels, would have been viewed by a high percentage of the population. The main impact that this movie had on the collective consciousness was this idea that a fantasy role-playing game could have real-world violent consequences. This would have been a reinforcement of the ideas propagated by Patricia Pulling and her crusade against Dungeons and Dragons. Another heartstring that Mazes and Monsters pulled upon was this fear or apprehension that all parents of college kids probably go through, which has to do with letting your child go into the world, in many cases on their own for the first time, and this fear about what they may get up to outside of the parents' rules and beyond the structures of living at home becomes a palpable experience for a lot of families. Previous Hollywood productions that also cast Satan as the villain included Rosemary's Baby in 1968, The Exorcist in 1973, and The Omen in 1976. So here we have a situation where a long periodic process of creative works focusing on Satanism slowly grooms the minds of society, so that when real-world stories about Satan and satanic abuse start to appear in the newspapers, the already seeded idea becomes too compelling to ignore. We touched upon this phenomenon in our cattle mutilation episode, which was Renegade Files episode 65. Check that one out. But it seems like the cattle mutilations also came along at the perfect time to get wrapped up in this satanic panic. Cattle mutilations made national news from the 60s and into the 80s. And with all the stories of satanic violence in the news at the time, the cattle mutilations were just one more thing that was blamed on the Satanists. And this is unfortunate because genuine cattle mutilations are a total mystery. Linda Moulton Howe has done tons of work on this subject. You can dive deep into that in our episode on cattle mutilations, which was Renegade Files episode 65. And to tie up this section on media that fueled the Satanic Panic, there are a few pivotal books. The first up is Mike Warneke's 1972 memoir, The Satan Cellar. And that's cellar as in salesman, so not the dark, scary storage rooms they have underneath homes up north. We don't have those deep in the uncharted tropics. If you dig down 5 feet here, you hit water. So, anyway, this book was written as a biography of the author, looking back on his rise through the recruitment and management of departments of a national satanic cult, from his perspective of now having been saved and converted to Christianity. It's possibly framed as a warning for Christian parents, and has been said to alternate between being extremely disturbing and extremely boring. In the book, we learn that Warneke was orphaned as a child and eventually introduced into Satanism. We hear of sexual orgies, alcohol abuse, drug dealing and using, and Warneke's rise in the ranks of Satanism to the level of high priest. He says he presided over satanic rituals that included magical spells, summoning demons, ritual sex, kidnapping, and all manner of debauchery. He eventually finds Jesus and becomes an evangelist preacher and a stand-up comedian. The book was a bestseller in the religious category. He made millions of dollars through his ministry and by producing a string of records and VHS tapes, most of them of him basically preaching on the subjects of Satanism and sin and all the perils therein. A little bit of stand-up comedy mixed in because that always goes together. In 1991, Cornerstone magazine launched an investigation into the claims made in Warneke's book. They interviewed 100 of his acquaintances, family members, and friends, and concluded that his memoir was entirely fiction. It seemed that he had not only made up all of the stories about being involved as a high-ranking official in a national satanic cult, but that he had also made up the majority of the incidental relationships, activities, and accomplishments woven throughout the satanic narrative in the book as well. He also lied about ever having long hair. He did not. Scandalous. The last bit of media that fueled the Satanic Panic, or at least the last one we'll cover here, was another, now fully discredited book called Michelle Remembers from 1980, written by Canadian psychiatrist Lauren Pazder and his psychiatric patient Michelle Smith, who eventually became his wife. The book describes the hypnosis regression sessions conducted on patient Michelle by Dr. Pazder over the course of 14 months, where Michelle was hypnotized for 600 hours in total. In these sessions, she regressed to her 5-year-old self and told the doctor all of her memories of satanic ritual abuse that occurred to her as a child from 1954 to 1955. This was perpetrated by her mother, Virginia, and other members of a satanic cult in Victoria, British Columbia. Michelle and the doctor discovered hundreds of ritualistic abuse sessions performed on the young girl by an extensive network of Satanists. Satan was physically conjured a few times, and this all culminated in an 81-day ritual that wound up with Jesus and a few angels showing up as well to save the girl in the end. The doctor and the patient sought help from churches, exorcisms, going so far as to travel to the Vatican. The book, Michelle Remembers, was first published as articles in People and National Enquirer. During 1980, Pazder and Smith toured the United States to promote the book and eventually secured over $300,000 for book and movie deals. The vast majority of claims in the book have been thoroughly debunked and proven false by numerous researchers and journalists, and Dr. Pazder has recanted his claims that the Church of Satan, associated with Anton LaVey, was the organization that abused Michelle. And he did this, kind of took it all back when LaVey threatened to sue him for libel. Then, in 1989, Oprah Winfrey had Michelle Smith on her show, together with Laurel Rose Wilson, the author of another fully fictitious Satanic Ritual Abuse book called Satan's Underground. Both of these guests' experiences were presented by Oprah as incontrovertible fact, and not once did she question the authenticity of any claim in either book. Fake news. Finally, as a footnote to this section, we have the not so much media that influenced the Satanic Panic, but a movie that was influenced by this moral panic in the 2019 horror comedy B-grade film called Satanic Panic, which is about the exploits of Sam, a girl on her first day as a pizza delivery driver. She's at the end of a long day and a disappointing amount of tips, and her last delivery turns out to be taking pizzas to a group of Satanists who are looking for someone to sacrifice. This embroils her in the fight for her life, and Sam must fight off satanic witches, evil spells, and demons, all while trying to keep her body and soul intact. Never seen this one, but I think I'll put it on my Halloween list for this year. Halloween is a few months away, so if you watch it too, I'll do a review of it for us on the Patreon page. If you want to support the show, visit patreon.com/renegadefiles, where you can check out everything there for a free week. Thanks to the RFA agents who support the show on Patreon already. You make the show work. Cheers. Okay, this is real-time flow here, and I just paused what I was doing and watched the trailer for Satanic Panic online, and on second thought, let's pick another movie for our annual Halloween film review on Patreon. I could have edited this part out, but I'm just keeping it real. That movie looks terrible, and not in a good way. We'll do something else. I don't know what yet. Stay tuned. And if you have a suggestion, put a comment on any of our Instagram posts where we are at Renegade Files on Instagram. And while you're there, give us a follow. And like I said, put a comment on any of our posts for your idea of a holiday movie that we can all watch, and I'll do a review of it for us. So anyway, all of the worry about Dungeons and Dragons, kids playing some freaky basement game, and parents couldn't understand it, and also this list of popular culture creative products came together to make fertile ground for what would become the full-blown satanic panic of the 80s. This moral panic culminated in what is now known as the McMartin preschool trial. And this brings us to the final section in this episode. Part 3. The Daycare Scare. The McMartin preschool trial was a daycare sexual abuse case in the 1980s, prosecuted by Los Angeles District Attorney Ira Rayner, where members of the McMartin family, who operated a preschool in Manhattan Beach, California, were charged with hundreds of acts of abusing kids in their care. This was the parents' nightmare, right? Accusations were made in 1983, and trials lasted for 7 years until 1990, and resulted in no convictions, and all charges being dropped. At the time, it was the longest and most expensive series of criminal trials in American history. I think it still might be. What happened was this. In 1983, Judy Johnson, mother of one of the preschool's young students, reported to the police that her son had been sexually abused by both her estranged husband and by McMartin preschool teacher Ray Buckey, who was the grandson of school founder Virginia McMartin. The accused, Ray's mother, also worked at the daycare. Some of the things the mother said her son had told her included animals being abused at the school, and daycare helper and accused molester Ray Buckey flying through the air like a witch. Ray was investigated by police at the time but was not arrested due to lack of evidence. But the story prompted police to mail a form letter to 200 parents who had kids who had gone to or were going to this same daycare. And in the letter, parents were encouraged to ask their children about a list of sketchy details that might prove abuse at the school. Like if they had ever seen Ray leave the classroom with a kid alone. Or if they had ever seen him tie up a kid. And a bunch of other leading questions, and the result was a flurry of accusations. It seems like the popular culture products, like the movies and books we've mentioned so far, impacted the interpretations and imaginations of both the students and the parents at the time. Here are a few of the crazy stories some of the kids told. Some said there were extensive tunnels and underground bunkers under the daycare facilities where the children were taken to perform elaborate satanic rituals. One student said that school staff had kidnapped a baby gorilla from the zoo, and the baby gorilla's finger was cut off to get blood for a ritual. Children said that one of the men who worked at the daycare facility, I guess Ray, would routinely perform a spell that enabled him to fly through the air. But no one ever proved any of this. The police did initiate excavations but found no tunnels underneath the school. No one ever investigated the truth of any missing gorillas at the local zoo, and I guess they just believed that a daycare worker had solved unpowered human flight through witchcraft. One child said that kids were routinely flushed down toilets where they spilled out into empty rooms where they were molested before being cleaned up and dried off and presented back to their parents. And there was one story that played out in court that told of the founder of the school undressing all 40 of the students at once and having them dance around naked in the classroom, and then dressing them all again before sending them home as if nothing had happened. Under cross-examination, school founder Virginia McMartin basically asked, "Do you have any idea what it would take for one person in a single room to strip 40 5-year-olds naked, keep all their clothes and shoes and socks separated, and then redress all of them in their rightful clothes and send them home? Trying to do that with 10 kids that age would probably take the whole day if you could do it at all." She basically said this entire thing is ludicrous, and she maintained that position throughout the 7-year trial, maintaining her innocence the entire time. Some of the kids recanted their stories, but confirmation bias allowed authorities and courts to see both silence and denials of abuse as evidence that abuse was actually taking place, and this in the absence of any physical evidence. Also, this may have been a sort of knee-jerk reaction to so many kids who weren't believed over the years in cases of true and terrible abuse. In fact, a slogan of the entire trial in the media was, "Believe the children." Later research demonstrated that the methods of questioning used on the children were extremely suggestive, leading to false accusations. Others say the questioning itself may have led to false memory syndrome. Of the original 360 children who made accusations under questioning, only 11 testified at the actual trials. And regarding these 11 kids, Michael P. Maloney, a clinical psychologist and professor of psychiatry, has testified as an expert witness on interviewing children. He was highly critical of the techniques used and referred to them as improper, coercive, directive, problematic, and adult-directed in a way that forced the children to follow a rigid script. He concluded that, quote, many of the kids' statements in the interviews were generated by the examiner, end quote. When shown a series of photographs by Danny Davis, who was the McMartin's defense lawyer, one child identified Chuck Norris as one of his abusers from the school. Now, let me be clear and say that this is in no way implying that children always make things up in serious cases like this. Victim blaming and ignoring abuse are two of the worst situations that arise in any system of justice or child protection. This is just one example of a moral panic that grew out of control, and the ideas and opinions and testimony of young children simply got swept up in it, along with the beliefs and ideas and actions of a whole nation of adults. It parallels the Salem witch trials in a lot of scary ways, one of the main ones being that most of the accusers were young children. I was talking about the research for this episode with some friends last night, and one of the questions that we entertained was, could something like this happen again today? I'm not sure that we ever arrived at any definitive answer, but I think our overall conclusions were that the mechanisms of accusation may have changed, and technology has put us in a place where we can watch our children through a camera in the daycare center on our phones in real time, so we may have created layers of safety for society that we didn't have in the 80s. However, all of that technology, which connects us and gives us a sense of security, also opens new doors to acts of creepiness and potential for wrongdoing on levels that would make up multiple Renegade Files episodes. Judy Johnson, the parent who made the initial allegations, also made bizarre and impossible statements about Raymond Buckey, including corroborating the story that he could fly. She was eventually hospitalized for acute schizophrenia, but her mental state was withheld from the defense for 3 years. When it was finally revealed, the prosecutor argued that her mental illness had been caused by the abuse of her son. But records indicated that she had suffered from schizophrenia prior to the trial. On January 18, 1990, after 3 years of testimony and 9 weeks of deliberation by the jury, Peggy McMartin Buckey was acquitted on all accounts. Ray Buckey was cleared on 52 of 65 counts. He was later retried for the remaining charges and acquitted on all of those, or they were dismissed. In the end, he spent 5 years in jail without ever being convicted of a crime. The trial had lasted 7 years and cost $15 million. And that's saying nothing of the cost of mental anguish of the accused, and not just them, of all the kids that were dragged through there and the entire process. A tragedy. Although the sexual abuse of children was and is a real and very serious problem, many allegations of satanic ritual abuse have proven to be largely and often false. Not to say it's fully fiction, but often it is. In time, the satanic panic just sort of faded out. Reasons for the collapse of the phenomenon include the failure of criminal cases against alleged abusers, the escalating amount of investigative journalists digging into the reality of the claims, plus a long list of successful lawsuits against mental health professionals for manipulating or otherwise coaching people to recall false narratives about their pasts. In the end, we all want to believe our children and protect them from harm. The most important thing we can do is listen to kids. But, as the Russian proverb tells us, "Duvier no provier." Trust, but verify. Thank you sincerely for investigating the Satanic Panic with me. I am so happy to have you in the Renegade Files crew. Remember to look for our summer series of shorter episodes called Short Drives. Those will post every Friday in June, July, and August. These are extra content, do not replace the bi-weekly full episodes, and are just a gift to you for being a fan of the show. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for rating the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Because of you, we are rocking 4.7 stars, and this helps the show find new listeners. If you have rated the show, then you have made that happen and have helped others find us. If you haven't yet, then feel that personal glow and adrenaline rush of seeing all 5 stars light up when you tap that last one on Spotify or Apple, where it says to rate the show. Fast bullet point instructions for finding those rating sections on Spotify and Apple are in the show notes, because they don't make it easy, but I make it easy for you. So go to the show notes and check it out and give us a rate if you haven't yet. And thank you so much if you have. You have helped us grow. Until our next adventure, I'm your host, Lex Gordon. Stay wild, clockwork child.